Good day. My name is Carel van Aardt and I'm from the Bureau of Market Research, where I head up the Market Intelligence Research Unit. During the past year, the Bureau of Market Research, in collaboration with the Market Research Foundation, established a multi-dimensional consumer segmentation tool for South Africa. And I'll be focusing on this today in this videocast with an emphasis on the provincial distribution. So firstly, what I'll be focusing on is I'm just going to provide some background to the research. Then I'm going to focus on the market segmentation approach used, followed by the BMR's consumer market segmentation tool and give some details on that before I use MAPS data to apply that to the consumer market segmentation tool in order to see what the value of this tool can be for marketers. Just as a background, the first question is that what is meant by consumer market segmentation? It's important to note in this regard that consumer market segmentation indices have been used internationally to segment consumer markets, and consumer segmentation indices like the LSMs or the Living Standard Measure have been used in South Africa to segment consumer markets for quite some time. Many consumer market segmentation indices used in South Africa are based on a single dimension, like for example income or living standards or consumer behavior, etc. However, internationally, consumer market segmentation indices have become much more multidimensional as big data, data joining, artificial intelligence, machine learning methods have become much more prevalent. The question could be asked, but why is consumer market segmentation so important? The reasons why it's important is that it's imperative for marketers to identify markets for their specific products and services and to identify the characteristics of such markets. By tracking different consumer market segments, changes in such market segments can be identified and can be acted upon. Market segmentation also aids in ensuring targeted above the line as well as below the line marketing. And through market segmentation, detailed knowledge about consumer market segments are being realized. The tracking of changes in consumer market segments have become possible because of the newer techniques, especially with respect to segmentation methods. There are a variety of market segmentation approaches. Firstly, it can be either unidimensional, like for example a single dimension like income or living standards, or multidimensional in the sense, for example, that it can have two or more axes. Then it can also be quantitative or qualitative. It can be discrete, which for example means that it cannot be placed on a spectrum, or it can be continuous, which means that it can be placed on a spectrums like the LSMs, like from LSM1 to LSM10. It can be autonomously generated through machine learning, or it can be predefined formation, like for example through cluster analysis and factor analysis. It can be an homogeneous, or it can be a more complex segmentation tool. It can be dynamic in the sense, for example, that it is self-adaptive, or it can be static. It can be fixed in structure so that it does not change over its lifespan, or it can be self-evolving. For the purposes of the BMR segmentation approach, we've taken a multidimensional approach, and here we've got two axes. It's quantitative. It's both discrete, which means, for example, here that we've got very detailed segment descriptors, but it can also be continuous in the sense that it can be placed on a spectrum. It's autonomously generated through machine learning methods. It deals with complex dynamics within the segments. It is dynamic in the sense also that it allows you to track different segments over time, and it's self-evolving in the sense that it's self-adaptive. When we had to select segmentation cluster variables, it was decided to, on the one axis, to use an indicator of household income, household expenditure, etc., household wealth, living standards, and we termed it consumption capacity. And this axis then deals with refers to the spending capacity of consumers as proxied by employment status, personal income, and household expenditure. Then there's also on the other axis an indication of the level of development of consumers, personal development, human capital development, and this was termed consumption potential, and this refers to the broader human and social capital status of consumers as proxied by educational attainment, digital inclusion, and purchasing style. And this, by bringing these two together, it creates a consumption capacity, consumption potential nexus. Just to give you an example of why this is so important to have both. Let's take, for example, two consumers. Both these consumers earn below 50,000 rands per annum, so they can basically be classified as very low income earners. The one of these income earners is staying in a rural area, and this person only have got a primary education. The other person is a student that is still earning very little, but has just completed his or her medical studies. So these two people are the same with respect to consumption capacity at present, because they both earn below 50,000, but their consumption potential for the future is very, very different. So therefore, the two axes. Let's just look at the way that the segmentation model has been populated. Firstly, we make use of MAPS data that was obtained from the Market Research Foundation. The 6 variables, namely the 3 consumption capacity variables and the 3 consumption potential variables, were then checked in a variety of ways for reliability, for validity, for structural integrity, and we also did some parameter checks to ensure, for example, that this really reflects reality. For example, on employment, we had to ensure that it is similar to the results of the quarterly labor force survey. Then also, we had a long look at the 3 socio-economic capacity variables to ensure, for example, that they are very well structured, and we also then use that to build the consumption capacity index by means of machine learning methods. We did the same with respect to the to the consumption potential variables, and what realized was that final index with on the one axis then consumer consumption capacity and on the other one consumption potential. And this index basically looks then as follows. So on the one axis, you've got consumption capacity, low, middle, or high. And on the other axis, you've got consumption potential, low, middle, high. A typical low consumption capacity, low consumption potential would be a person that is low earning, typically not economically active or unemployed, and the person also have got a fairly low level of education, also a low level of digital inclusion with respect to not having a smartphone, for example, not having access to tablets, etc. While, for example, a person that's got a high consumption capacity and a high consumption potential is typically a person that's employed in the formal sector of the economy, is also a person that have got a high level of education, probably either completed secondary education or mostly tertiary education. So that also gives you then an idea with respect to the developmental status in terms of human and social capital of the different people. When we apply this to the South African population by using the MAPS data, you will find, for example, that the distribution is as follows. With respect to consumption capacity, you've got on the low side about 17 million, and this makes sense when you look, for example, at poverty statistics in South Africa. While, for example, on the high side, this links up with the quarterly labor force survey and also the quarterly employment survey, which gives you an indication, especially the QES, of the number of formal sector workers and formal sector entrepreneurs, and that figure gels very well with that. When you look, for example, at your consumption potential scale, and you also compare that, for example, to the number of people with a completed secondary education and tertiary education, that's more towards the high consumption potential category, while, for example, the people with a lower education gel very nicely with it. So just on the parameter side, these figures makes a lot of sense. Then when you look at the provincial distribution of the consumers per segment, and remember this presentation is also then there to give you a provincial view, you will notice that when you look at your low consumption capacity, low potential provinces with a very high percentage, there is the Eastern Cape, Limpopo, Mpumalanga, and these provinces are also then typically seen as the poorer provinces in South Africa. While when you look, for example, at your high consumption capacity, high potential, you will notice that these are typically more Gauteng, the Western Cape, that we expected of this. So this gives you a very nice breakdown with respect to the provincial distribution of consumers per segment. The Bureau of Market Research also has got a top-up syndicate where we also drill these figures down not only to a municipal level, but also to a main place level and even down to a sub-place level, so that you can even do much more detailed consumer market segmentation analysis. Moving then just to a description of some of the segments, that you can see which segment descriptors are available. When you look at the low consumption capacity, low consumption potential group, you will notice that these are typically poorer people where the expenditure is more than their income, mostly not economically active or unemployed. They focus on buying necessities. The physiological and the safety needs are predominant. In their buying decisions, they need strong guidance, and therefore influentials and celebrities are very effective in that space. They are generally followers looking for leaders. When you provide them information about your products and services, it should be incremental instructions. It should be, keep it simple and specific. You need to focus in your marketing message on survival existence needs, because you find, for example, that this group is incredibly good at budgeting in order to survive. A lot of the budgets are not written down. The budgets are often in the heads of the people, in the minds of the people, but they're very good at budgeting. When you look at consumption potential, you will notice that this group have generally got a very low level of education, a low level of digital inclusion, low maturity with respect to developmental levels, low need to achieve, extrinsically motivated, which means, for example, that they're not generally not motivated within themselves, but outside factors motivate them, low adaptability to circumstances, low level of assertiveness, low self-confidence, low conceptual development, and they often experience themselves as unable to change their own circumstances, and they are often also insecure about the situation and the future. On the other side of the spectrum, you've got your high consumption capacity and high consumption potential. And I just need to emphasize that there are detailed segment descriptors for all 9 segments. This is just for example purposes. This group have got middle to high incomes. They're mostly formal sector employed or self-employed. The focus is on buying necessities as well as luxuries. The esteem and personal growth needs is very, very important. They require little guidance in the sense, for example, that they make their own decisions. They view themselves as being leaders, so there's a strong leader mentality. It's very important to reward or support their good behavior, and loyalty programs is especially effective with respect to this group. It's very important to focus on status aspects and personal growth aspects. Conspicuous consumption also high here. And where they differ from the international counterparts is that this group internationally often save quite a lot. In South Africa, there's a lot of overspending and undersaving with respect to this group. Generally, they have a very high level of education. They also have a very high level of digital inclusion. They have a high level of maturity, a high need to achieve, intrinsically motivated, which means that they are self-driven, very adaptable to circumstances, high level of assertiveness in the sense, for example, that they will demand good service, good products, very high level of self-confidence, high level of conceptual development, and they experience themselves as able. And also where it differs from the international experience, they're only relatively secure. And this is because of a lot of threats in South Africa, like crime, like, for example, load shedding, etc., that makes them semi-secure in South Africa. Then just to apply the model to some trends. Firstly, on people reading a newspaper. And what's fascinating in this regard is that you will notice that consumption capacity is not such a strong driver of reading a newspaper, but consumption potential is. Namely, medium potential here, high readers, medium potential there, and medium and high potential there, high readers, etc. The difference is that on your high consumption capacity, it's mostly that newspapers are accessed on digital platforms, while, for example, paper-based newspapers is very important with respect to your low consumption capacity, medium potential, and medium consumption capacity, medium potential consumers. Then, just moving on to the provincial distribution of newspaper readers per segment. Very interesting here is that you will notice that your poorer provinces have also got a high readership, and especially paper-based readership, that they have in Eastern Cape here, also Limpopo, Mpumalanga, for example, there. While very high levels of readership, especially online readership, in Gauteng, the Northern Cape, the Western Cape. So you will find that very strongly there. Also, when you look at the number of consumers in the various segments who watch television, television penetration very high in South Africa. And you will also notice here that even your consumers with a low consumption capacity is very strong on television watching. And the one thing that we've seen here is that your low consumption capacity, medium potential people are not only watching the government or the state television channel, but they've also making use of subscription services. And the subscription services that they're making use of are mostly the access packages that they're very strong on. You notice here that also in your medium consumption capacity, there is a very strong presence with respect to television watching, and also in your high consumption capacity. And when you look at the figures, you will notice, for example, that of your population here, between that of the ages 15 plus, that's just at about 43 million, about 31 million of them, about 3/4 actually watch television on a continuous basis. When you look then at the provincial distribution of this, you will notice that it's right throughout the spectrum that there's high television watching. On the low consumption capacity, low potential groupings, you will notice that the Eastern Cape, KwaZulu-Natal, Limpopo, Mpumalanga, fairly high, while when you look, for example, at your high consumption capacity, high potential, once again, high in Gauteng, the Western Cape, etc. But here we find, for example, that this is mostly from subscription services as well as streaming services that's very high in this specific group. When we look at the number of consumers in the various segments who have a transactional savings account, you'll find, for example, that right throughout the spectrum that transactional accounts are fairly high, and this is about 25 million of a total of about 43 million. So your penetration rates with respect to transactional accounts are very high. And we find, for example, here that even your low consumption capacity and your middle consumption capacity consumers have transactional accounts, and this is especially because of the large presence of a lot of volume market financial service providers that have come into the market during the past 2 decades. As we move up the spectrum, we find, however, that the number of accounts that people have got increase, and so people become increasingly multi-bank as we move from low consumption capacity to medium consumption capacity to high consumption capacity. Then just finally, a provincial distribution of transactional account holders per segment. And what we find, for example, here is that the provinces where it's very high with respect to basic transactional accounts include, for example, in the low consumption capacity, low potential group, the Eastern Cape, also Limpopo province, Mpumalanga, and what we find, for example, here, that it's mostly a single bank account that a person have got with a strong volume market provider in the financial sector. While, for example, when we look at your high consumption capacity, high potential, that the strong provinces here are Gauteng, also the Northern Cape, the Western Cape, mostly people that's multi-banked, etc. So this was a quick overview of the BMR's the BMR's consumer market segmentation model, and this provided also an insight into why the model was constructed, how it was constructed, what the model looks like then, and just some examples of findings from the model using the MAPS data. Thank you so much for watching the video cast, and I hope that the model will also be highly beneficial to you.